Welcome to Meet Your Aldermen, the podcast that aims to inform Chicago residents about the people who represent them. I'm Sarah Scott, with a resolution to go ice skating at one of the park rinks before winter is over.
And I'm Eric Eber with a resolution to spend more time at Portillo's. This episode is the first part of our mini-series, Meet Your Government, where we take a hard look at the city's politics and its governance. For a more in-depth explanation about this project, we recommend you listen to the explainer we published earlier. But here's a quick summary. Through interviews with students enrolled in a policy lab at the University of Chicago, we're going to explore the city's most significant problems as they relate to 4 areas: police accountability, community engagement, city council, and the budget.
This interview is with Joe Ferguson, who led that policy lab. Although a Boston native, Joe is a bona fide expert in the Chicago way. He spent 15 years with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, where he was the chief for its money laundering and forfeiture section and a deputy in the complex fraud and financial crime section. In 2009, he ventured deeper into the belly of the beast and became the Inspector General for the City of Chicago, a position he held until October 2021.
Joe no longer works for the city, but remains dedicated to making it a better place for all residents. He stayed active in a number of different ways. As the director of the aforementioned Policy Lab, as a Pritzker Fellow at the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics, and most importantly, as the founding executive director of ReChicago, a nonprofit that, according to its mission statement, aims to align Chicago's governance structure with 21st century challenges, needs, and values through a process that institutionalizes good governance and sustainable and healthy civic engagement.
We cover the most common topics associated with Chicago, but then go deeper and have Joe reveal the underlying architecture that ties everything together. Joe does a wonderful job of explaining complex and admittedly sometimes boring bureaucratic systems and highlights the impact those systems have on ordinary citizens. We hope you enjoy.
Joe Ferguson, thank you very much for taking the time to actually sit down with me in the studio. And you are our first non-aldermanic guest. You are one of the teachers for what I think might be my favorite class so far at Harris. So thank you very much.
And just so everyone who's listening knows, he hasn't gotten his grade yet, so that sort of discounts that remark. I appreciate what you're doing with the podcast. I appreciate UC3P. Which puts me in mind of Star Wars because I feel like I have to end with UC3BO. But I'm sure I'm not the only one that does that. But let's have at it.
I guess the first question really is, for someone as big in Chicago politics as you are, what initially got you into Chicago politics?
So I'm a former federal prosecutor, which makes me a lawyer, which means I check people on their words. The Inspector General is not a politician. It's not a political position. And a distinguishing characteristic between me and many of the guests that you have is I am not a politician. Mm-hmm. So from a personal perspective, I come from Boston originally, and a family that going back generations were undertakers and politicians.
Wonderful people.
In the Italian community, and undertakers in immigrant communities were often the leaders in the early part of the 20th century. And my great-great-grandfather was the undertaker for the Italian syndicalists Sacco and Vanzetti. They were anarchists in any way. He was the undertaker, and that thrust him into prominence in the Italian community, which was at political war with the Irish community at that time for who was going to be on the bottom rung of the ladder. But Chicago, it's blood sport. It really both turbocharges the complications of good governance generally, and certainly is a very interesting place to be amidst. In the work of an IG, it's not political, but it's definitely politicized, and you have to be mindful of the political environment in framing your message, in deciding, timing, and deciding thrust, and so on and so forth.
And so you spent time as a prosecutor, but what then brought you to the actual role of the Inspector General?
I was actually working as a prosecutor, so a fair amount of the work that I did over time at the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Chicago involved federal program fraud. A lot of it having some form of nexus to terrorism financing, but federal program fraud is quite often investigated by inspectors generals for the affected agencies. So I began working with a lot of offices of inspector general at the federal level and gained an appreciation that it gets to do, they get to do something that no one else does, and that is not merely conducting the investigations and the prosecutions to root out the malfeasance and to recover money, but IGs also have the ability to then take what was learned from that particular situation and flip it into a government performance audit to figure out what is it systemically that actually makes possible, these outflows, these inefficiencies that quite often involve fraud.
And so would you say you saw what Chicago was like, what the political scene was like? You're like, this is cutthroat, this is brutal. I want to be in the middle of it.
Yeah, well, I have many years as a federal prosecutor, so the arena is, it sort of becomes a part of who you are. And frankly, the organizing theme for a lot of my life, going back to my childhood, is abuse of authority, abuse of power, all the way back to the neighborhood that I grew up in Boston. So here's why. Here's what's different because of its political character and American political character. I've sat across the table from people who were the orchestrators of terrorist bombings, and their motivations were political as well, responsive to oppression. This was mostly in the Middle East, mostly in Israel and the territories. They told you who they were, and you could pretty much take it at face value. In Chicago, no. With Chicago politicians, especially the ones that are of the more rogue nature, going back over history, you can't take their word anywhere. You have to figure out what it's all about yourself. I like puzzles. I like mysteries. So
you like a challenge.
Yeah.
Before you started in on the inspector general position, this is a two-parter. What did you think that you could bring to the role or did you think that the role needed to be improved? And then second, what did you expect to see from city council and then from the Chicago governance at large?
So I got to take the position on the heels of a former colleague of mine at the Inspector General's office, David Hoffman. And the way that this worked was back in the administration of Harold Washington, and for anyone listening, go see the movie Punch 9 whenever it is available for viewing again. During the administration of Harold Washington, the progressive bloc, and it truly was a progressive bloc at the time, one of the things that they were pushing for was the need for independent oversight. And it was not enacted. There were precursor investigative offices. They didn't do audits or anything like that. When Rich Daley was running for mayor in 1989.
Okay, this is Junior.
This is Richard M. Daley, yep. In 1989. He pledged to Lakefront liberals that he would follow through on the progressive desire for independent oversight. And that's how the office came into being in May of 1989. But installed in that office was someone who he was familiar with, who knew him going way back to his time as state's attorney. And that person did a good job, but really didn't inhabit the full mission. And IGs have an extraordinary statutory mission to promote economy, effectiveness, efficiency, and integrity in the operations of government. Those are literally written into the law. If you inhabit them fully and you have the right resources, you have an enormous amount of power. The first generation, it was very, very sort of conservative and narrow, only investigative because of, and this is Chicago, there's sort of a sinusoidal cycle between scandal and quote-unquote reform. Reform often constituted of bringing in some expert from the outside who has all the right credentials, installing them in the top position, and then having number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in the department be all people from City Hall to make sure that reformer doesn't go too far out of line. But over the years, the U.S. attorney was the true IG for the city, and it was in the form of criminal investigations in the early 2000s. 2 major scandals brought the FBI to interview Mayor Daley in his office in City Hall. Brought the FBI to execute a search warrant in the offices of the mayor around patronage hiring. And Mayor Daley thought, enough is enough. I need to have these things identified before
Hmm.
the U.S. attorney finds out.
And what did you think that you were going to find in the course of your role as the Inspector General? Like, what was your impression up to this point of Chicago politics and government?
Yeah, look, of course, I expected to find corruption. That's the
Hmm.
history. So I wasn't. It wasn't like I went into it with my eyes shut, but I was a bit naive. On the way out, the first assistant U.S. attorney at the time had been in the office for about 35 years, headed the organized crime unit. He was sort of like a Yoda-like character to all of us.
Hmm.
Back to Star Wars at UC-3PO, and he said, "Look, you think you know what you're walking into, but let me just tell you, it's way worse. There's
Hmm.
nothing like it." And it took me a few years to sort of figure it out. But it's thoroughly in the culture. It's an aspect of the essence of the culture of how Chicago operated for a long time. It's changing, but culture is the last thing to change,
Hmm.
and culture eats policy for breakfast every day.
Yeah.
So there actually needs to be an iterative kind of generational determination to stay with the reform and the improvements over a long period of time.
Hearing what you're saying, you seem to be interested not only in finding out the problem, but also finding out the systemic reasons,
Yep.
but the underlying reasons for this. Did your role as the Inspector General help to solidify, shed light onto those systemic problems?
So when I came to the office, there was a nascent, like literally brand spanking new audit shop,
Hmm.
just a couple of people, and the people running the investigative portion of the office, which was the history of the office, really didn't understand the dynamics. I'd had a lot of experience in the realm. And one of the distinctions between audit and investigation is audit, you put what you found out there 100%. It's all out there, the underlying evidence, the analysis, the data, and you do it on the basis of comparative analysis, best practices that exist elsewhere. And I'll be candid about it. The media laps that up. It's just like, there's the story that we've been
Hmm.
trying to get at
Hmm.
all this time, right? And so the answer is yes. And between the office's performance audit shop and its police oversight shop, which is audit based evaluations, which
Hmm.
came online in 2017, that is a huge portion of a driver for people's understanding of what's going on and why it isn't what it should be. It's not simply that it isn't what it should be. That everybody knows. Excuse me, everybody knows, they experience that. The question is why?
Hmm.
And to put that out there then becomes sort of the new baseline from hopefully where the conversation then proceeds.
After having served in that role for as long as you did, can you fill in the blank here? Chicago's government is blank. How would you answer that?
Oy. And I only get one word.
No, 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 no. You don't get one word.
Okay.
But one sentence.
It's parochial, it's sclerotic, and it's unimaginative. And parochial's really an important word that I wouldn't have expected to be the first one to come out of my mouth. I should throw in significant corruption in the culture,
Sure.
but parochial in this sense. Chicago exceptionalism
Hmm.
it sort of it insinuates itself in all aspects of how the city operates. No, we're different.
Hmm.
And it's like, yeah, okay, we're different. Chicago is different from Phoenix, yes, but paving streets are paving streets.
Hmm.
Well, it's winter. Well, it's winter all over the place. And there are ways that this has been figured out. We tend not to look outside of ourselves, and we do things the way we do them because that's the way that they've always been done.
Hmm.
And that is really sort of baked into the culture of city operations.
Yeah, my dad talks about this. You've talked about this. Chicago residents have a love-hate relationship with the government, where it's almost so bad or so corrupt it's laughable. We laugh about it. We laugh about the size of our potholes. I was talking to my dad about the underfunded pensions, and he's like, "Oh yeah, they used to just laugh about how they were unfunded, and it's an amusing thing. It's a great anecdote until it becomes like too much,
Yeah.
and then it really becomes uncomfortable. So, What is it about? And by the way, those 3 words too were 3 words I wasn't expecting. I was thinking, what were the words? I mean, you didn't say corrupt.
Yep.
You didn't say dysfunctional.
Yep.
But all 3 did make sense. So what is it that makes Chicago particularly dysfunctional, or we'll say parochial, unimaginative? And then the other word was sclerotic. Which I think,
and that's sort of the University of Chicago word for what I said right after it is. We do things the way we do them because that's the way they've always been done. The operation of the government is rooted in its politics. Its politics are rooted in its past, and so we basically are bringing the past forward perpetually in a way that sort of carries blinders. But your observation about your dad and your conversations with your dad, I think there's something really important in there. It's not that Chicagoans love the inefficiencies or they love the corruption, although I think we're kind of in love with our corruption narrative because there's a romance to it and it distinguishes us, right? Or at least we think it does. But I think the fact of the matter is that we internalize all of the bad things because historically, the basic things that we were led to understand as what the government should be providing us, we were getting. The garbage got picked up. The streets got plowed when there was snow. We got garbage cans when we needed them. The real basic stuff. And the city used to be known as the city that works.
Right.
I think part of the unhappiness now is all of the downside of the city that works is still with us, but the city doesn't work so well anymore. And that, I think, bodes for sort of a different dynamic that's going on right now.
And why doesn't the city work maybe the way it used to, that daily thing, in that daily era?
So that's where our mindset is locked. We've discussed, and the folks listening wouldn't know this because they weren't in the class, but we've discussed ways that the city needs to change. And the fact of the matter is that part of the change is going to require a willingness on the part of the residents of the city and business in the city to relinquish those things that they get, that they associate with the job of government. So, I've mentioned the snow plows and picking up the garbage, but you have an old couch and you want to toss it. You throw it out in the back of your alley and you call your alderman's office and they'll make a special run to pick it up. That doesn't happen anywhere else in America.
Right.
We have to give that up, those little things like that, in order to kind of elevate the possibilities of what it is that our elected officials are doing. And so we're part of the problem in that regard as well.
Yeah.
So we just are stuck in the way that things have always been done. And, there are 2 things that people don't like: the way things are and change. And we are particularly resistant to change in Chicago.
So, these kind of problems, we're not the first ones to identify them. They are very well known. Besides citizens kind of clinging to certain aspects of government that are not overall really in the best interest of the city, why do you think that this dysfunctional system continues to persist?
I don't think that Chicagoans know that the government is theirs. Back to corruption and back to how the city has operated for a long time. Its operations are more aligned with the people in power than the power of the people. Democracy and Chicago in the same sentence doesn't belong. They're in tension with each other. We don't know our government is ours. One of the things that I am working towards is elevating public consciousness of the fact that we are distinguished from every other major city in the United States in that we don't have a constitution. We do not have a charter, a municipal charter. We don't have charter commissions that re-examine our governance. And that's a practice everywhere else that actually reifies and deepens the notion that the government is supposed to operate for the benefit of the people, and the people get to decide the dimensions and the dynamics and the components of government. That's American. And oddly, This great American city does not have that foundational platform in the form of a charter or a constitution, and does not engage in that very American exercise of actually the people themselves deciding what they want the government to be and what form of relationship they want to have.
And then, so Chicago does not have a charter. It did a long time ago. And then they tried in like the early 1900s to get one, and it fizzled out, never happened. But what Chicago does have is a massive municipal code. This is something that I know our class wrangled with, the difference between charter and code. Can you, for the listeners' benefit, describe? Chicago has a municipal code that lays out most of what they're supposed to do. So why is that different? Why is that lesser than a charter?
A charter, and again, I'll shift to the word constitution. It's a constitution. A constitution is a higher form of law, and a constitution can't be ignored. It's enforceable, and it can only be changed by the people themselves through referenda, supermajorities. The municipal code, statutes, ordinances, those are passed by the elected officials, and those are the rules. They're law. But they're harder to enforce, and they can be changed anytime by the people who have an interest in the outcomes of those things for their own benefit. We ignore those things. Citizens can't enforce them. They can't enforce a constitution or a charter. So a constitution's a higher form of law.
One of the most interesting things I heard in that regard was the appointment for one of the police chiefs under Rahm Emanuel. Can you give a little background on that one?
Yeah, after the Laquan McDonald video was released, one of the things that Mayor Emanuel did was toss the police superintendent over the side. That was Gary McCarthy. And there is a process set forth in the municipal code that provided for the police board to conduct a national search and provide the mayor with 3 finalists to choose from. And if a mayor could turn them aside, and it's by law was supposed to go back to the police board to come up with more names. Well, Rahm didn't like the names that were served up to him, and the president of the police board at the time was Lori Lightfoot. Rahm didn't like those names, and rather than sending it back to the police board, he went to the city council and asked the city council to suspend the operation of the law for selecting police superintendents for 30 days, and then put in the name of the person he wanted to be superintendent. That person was put through the council, and then then the law resumed after the fact, back to the old ways. But the mayor just basically said, "Hey guys, let's put aside the law for the next 30 days so I can do whatever the heck that I want to do." He does it, and on we go. That's the difference. You can't do that if that's a constitutional provision.
And with that, in that instance, there was tons of public outcry, a lot of investigations, a lot of pushback. No, I'm kidding. None of that happened.
None of that happened.
Super smooth. I mean, I don't even remember that happening. I had to look it up. I was like, "You are kidding me," and it's entirely true. So that that really was like, this is why we need it. So Chicago's on this track. It's been this way for a long time. What happens if Chicago does not reform itself?
Probably a continuation of the chronic ills that we have. As we've discussed in other contexts, the city has effectively operated with a structural deficit for 2 decades. Both the municipal code and state law requires balanced budgets. And so then the question is, well, how can you have a structural deficit if the law says you're supposed to have a balanced budget? Well, you apply accounting rules in the ways that make the numbers balance at the end of the day. Can't do that in other cities. So we'll continue to have structural deficits in all likelihood. Our pensions that are funded at the lowest level of any major city in the United States possibly tip into, and actually we're probably a couple years away for a couple of those pensions where we are literally paying our obligations to current retirees in real time with the money from active employees. There are no reserves. That will happen. We'll continue to struggle in all likelihood with legitimacy of the government itself, particularly the police department, because transparency is hampered. Access, true access, participatory governance, participatory democracy is hampered. And there will be, in significant possibility, a loss of confidence that actually the strengths of Chicago will prevail over its weaknesses. There's opportunities elsewhere in the United States, and we're seeing that right now, where people who can leave, leave. And one of the things that COVID brought us was the capacity, especially for those with the resources and those in sort of high positions in organizations, to work remotely. They pick up and leave and go live in Miami, and they move their businesses. That will start to impact our tax base and make everything harder and harder.
With the class that you taught, you divided us into 4 groups. So there was the budget group, looked at all the budget. There was community engagement. There's police accountability. And then the group I was in was city council. So what was your rationale for dividing the group into those 4 sections? So
if we were to restructure Chicago's government to align it more with the power of the people than the people in power, and this isn't Chicago specific. This is what happens in a lot of cities that undertake a hard reset. The powers of the legislature are fundamental, and how well they balance the powers of the executive. So that's why the city council, and our city council is not an effectively operating legislative body for lots of reasons. Police accountability is at the top of the challenges for municipalities around the country to examine. And obviously, Chicago has an especially complicated history and continuing complications around policing and police accountability. We're the subject of a federal consent decree. We've created this really, really complicated oversight architecture and infrastructure. Budget and finance, because we do it really poorly and different from everybody else. And to understand what we do relative to the law, in fact, and relative to other cities is really fundamentally important, because if we don't get that right, we're not going to be able to do all the other things we're supposed to do. And then finally, community engagement, and I used the term participatory democracy a couple minutes ago. And informed by our challenges with policing and police accountability nationally, and especially so in the wake of the civil unrest and demonstrations following the murder of George Floyd, community engagement, the ability to participate with the requisite opportunities at the right time, with the requisite information that's necessary in order to be informed in your participation. That is a true 21st century value, and it's something that Chicago hasn't really stepped into. So it's a priority nationally. It should be a priority for us if we're going to rewrite the rules.
Sweet. So now let's pick that apart a little bit. First, with police accountability, you already mentioned this. Like, it's a very messy and complex situation, but Chicago does in fact have many police oversight bodies. So the question is, why is the police department still flawed?
Well, so first off, with respect to the oversight architecture, no one has looked holistically at what it is that we've done in the creation of a whole bunch of new bodies, and they haven't been right-sized and integrated and coordinated. That's one. Two, is the Chicago Police Department still troubled? I think one needs to keep in mind that is a long-term, historically mediocre at best administrative body. Add on top of that corruption, add on top of that political influence, and you have a really complicated stew. Finally, police departments are paramilitary organizations, and those tend to be closed cultures. A closed culture over decades that carries corruption, patronage, the vestiges of the racism that exists in the society that they police. These all live in the Chicago Police Department. So it's a big job. And that oversight architecture, we've got the 1.0 version. We've got to do the 2.0 exercise. A charter commission would be a wonderful way to go about that.
So we actually talked to Alderman Rosa 2 days ago. Listeners might now be a little tired of me saying this was the chief sponsor for the CPAC ordinance, which is now ECPS. What are your thoughts? Because we've asked Alderman Rosa this, of course, but what are your thoughts about this new oversight, commission and architecture?
So first off, it shouldn't have been necessary. If the city council functioned the way it was supposed to function, as the true representatives in community, 50 aldermen means that each alderman represents a pretty well-defined community and neighborhood, and usually it's sort of It's a monoculture, socioeconomically, quite often racially or ethnically. But the upside of that is they really do know their communities, which means that if the city council, the public safety committee of the city council, were actually doing its job, engaging in true oversight of the police department through meaningful public hearings, we might not need a separate civilian commission. But it does not do anything in that regard. And so we literally needed to create a separate body constituted of civilians to do the job that our elected officials are failing to do. So it's important. It's important for amplification of voice from the community. It's important to amplify issues, and in that sense, infusing a sense of possibility and potential legitimacy in government itself, if not the police department immediately. So it's an important thing. It's also an incredibly complicated machine that they have created. 66 elected district councilors, 3 for each police district. The fact that they're being elected worries me greatly. Once you go to sort of an elected format, one would expect the police, the FOP itself, to install and support candidates for those offices. One would expect the powers that be that do not want to be subjected to true transparency, accountability, to make sure people who are oriented in that direction don't get elected. It's very complicated, but you know what? I used 1.0 and 2.0. Let's let the 1.0 go and run for a while and make the adjustments. But it's a really symbolically important, and beyond that, I actually think voice is really important right now because the government doesn't give people voice.
Yeah. So to shift now towards the budget. So this is perhaps the most, because people can get why police accountability doesn't work. They can understand community engagement. And then, city council, like the main spotlight always goes on city council, but the budget is something that is really complicated to understand. How should the budget be designed that differs from the current process? Does budget implementation need to be overturned as well? And not just the process of designing it and stuff like that, but also the implementation of the budget.
So the way things work right now, there aren't many public inputs and there aren't many legislative inputs on the way to building a budget. It's really an operation that comes out of the fifth floor. It is delivered to us whole, this massive, complex document. And there is a little bit of process, but usually that is introduced early in October. And then for the next 17 days, we have this march through departments, hearings. And for many of those commissioners, it is the only time they will ever appear before a legislative committee or during the course of the year. And for many of the aldermen, it is the only time they will hear from a commissioner heading a department. A very small amount of those budget hearings, therefore, are devoted to a discussion of the budget. It's devoted to the sorts of things that you would expect to be in discussion, in hearings over the course of the year, which is, why isn't something working better? Why is this issue happening? Do you need help from us in some way? Do we need to change the law? Is there some regulatory thing that we can do for you? None of that occurs. Everything gets compressed in these 17 days. And I should say those hearings, they're not supported with any expertise. The city council itself does not have bodies within it, components within it that have the requisite resources and expertise to break down the budget, to analyze the budget, to analyze legal aspects or implications of the budget. Budgets get introduced without any form of performance metrics. There haven't been hearings during the year. Our council's too weak. And we don't put in the work because we don't have the resources, we don't have the expertise, and all of that comes to bear on the budget, which means, some things get changed during those 3 weeks in October going into November. But at the end of the day, the mayor is the one who largely decides what we're going to spend and what we're going to prioritize.
And so then, because the other side of that budget process, you have one mayor and 50 aldermen. Why is it that city council is so weak? There's 50 of them. Why are they so weak?
Well, there being 50 of them, there's always the question of what's the right number. And if you go back and look at the history of Chicago, that has been a topic of discussion for about 150 years. What's the right number? And that's what we talk about today. One disadvantage to having that big a number is it makes collective action really difficult, especially in a city with, and I used the word tribalism before, there's an aspect of tribalism where caucuses cluster around ethnic or racial identities, and they're in competition with each other. Collective action is really difficult. To bring it to bear today, you also have to overcome sort of the customs of the past. And there is kind of a learned subordination and helplessness almost of the council in relation to the mayor. Your job is to support the mayor. And there are aldermen today who may disagree vehemently with the mayor on some particular position, but ultimately they support the mayor, and they're going to acquiesce at the end of the day. And the mayor holds an enormous amount of power in terms of turning the screws on access to resources and things being done at the ward level. And aldermen, therefore, don't want to cross the mayor.
So another big thing, so the topic of do we have too many aldermen is a big one that's been discussed so many times. I would say like the number one thing, if you ever learn about city council, is aldermanic privilege, aldermanic prerogative. You know, that's the city council 101. You learn that right away. Having like looked at it so much, I'm still not sure. Is it kind of a red herring? Is it a problem? Is it multifaceted? I know a lot of aldermen today, they still like having their privilege. So what are your thoughts on aldermanic privilege?
Aldermanic privilege has been made a boogeyman because quite often it is associated with corruption, small bore corruption. And I think too much is made of it. On the one hand, the idea of handing to one alder the ability to veto, put a block on some particular form of government action that affects their ward, you can say that's super democratic, or you could say that's actually preventing the proper function of government. I think there's a middle road here that I seldom hear spoken of. If aldermanic prerogative was tied to true community engagement, where the aldermen had processes to solicit the views of their constituents around issues like zoning, right, and development, and they exercised the prerogative as simply the tool by which the community's voice is operationalized, I'd say great. But there's no one way, there's no requirement for community engagement. So for some aldermen, prerogative is simply this lever that they have to get what they want, the way that they want it, how they want it, when they want it, regardless of what the constituents want. It's sort of a counterweight to the power of City Hall, if you will, and frankly susceptible to all kinds of corruption. But if we put some parameters on it, if we required community engagement around these things where the prerogative was exercised, if we required transparency, reporting of every time the prerogative was exercised, right? So that the media could immediately see rather than it being buried in some note in a file in the building department, right? That would change its dimensions.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good segue to the last part, that community engagement aspect. So how does the current system, you've answered this a little bit already, how does the current system keep citizens ill-informed or ill-equipped to voice their concerns, right? And what is the role of voters and residents? And we've already talked about this, that we're a little bit complicit in this. So what are the role of voters and citizens?
So in the last election, in the runoff, for which Lori Lightfoot, I think, garnered 72% of the vote, and all the discussion was she had a mandate from that number. What often gets left out is only 33% of eligible voters voted.
Right.
And not voting is voting for the status quo. But the fact of the matter is the processes of the city are obscure, sometimes complicated, require navigation of an expert. We don't make information easily accessible to the public in user-friendly ways. We don't make it accessible to the media to even explain to the public, right? So there needs to be a lot more transparency, and we actually need in some fashion to codify the access points, the points of participation where those inputs of the community's perspective is actually allowed for. We don't have that right now. It's really kind of random. And so we actually need to create something of a platform that tells people, one, you're going to get all the information you need. Two, there's a means for you to exercise your voice beyond voting. And three, and this is probably the most important thing, is that the decision-making process actually reflect the community's perspective and views in those in the engagement of those mechanisms. And that people just don't believe that's going to happen. So none of those things being available, and the history of the city leaving people to say it doesn't matter anyway, leaves people to not participate at all, which gets us to the low voter turnout, which gets us to the status quo.
One of the things that I felt through the course was, holy cow, I'm learning so much about city council in Chicago, but also, holy cow, I don't know how I can get my arms around this problem. It's so deep, it's so wide, and I kind of hope that the listeners feel the same way, that there's just so much to kind of chew on. And I think I've noticed that there's kind of a bit of a culture change in city council where there are some aldermen that do seem to be willing to take on that challenge, to not go just status quo, to really maybe even not revive, but revise the role of alderman. Do you think that such a culture change has been happening?
I think what we're seeing is an awareness of the potentiality of a culture change. As you know, 15 people who raised their right hand and took an oath in May of 2019 to be aldermen will not be taking the oath in May of 2023. That's 30% of the council right there. Actually, the number is now 16 with Ed Burke saying he's not going to run for re-election. That's 32% of the city council right there. Chances are it's close to a 40% turnover. And there's a generational aspect to that. And what I see is the younger, more junior tenured alders came to the city council thinking they were coming to a legislative body. And the frustration and the chaos right now has to do with the fact that it is not an orderly functioning legislative body that's properly endowed with the resources to be an effective legislative body. And this younger generation of alders aren't putting up for it. And so if this next election yields a significant expansion of that particular group, that younger generational cohort, who just isn't going to have the old ways, I think probably in the next cycle, it's an incredibly chaotic city council, but it will spawn people to say, all right, enough's enough. We got to figure out how it is that we're actually going to govern positively. I think that may itself prompt consideration of a charter commission. But yeah, change is in the air, and change needs to be in the air, because I think most people feel, even if it feels overwhelming, how we might go about changing things. I think generally people get things can't go on the way that they've always gone on and have things turn out well for much longer.
And what about you? How have you stayed involved in Chicago politics and governance reform?
I don't know.
Well, besides teaching classes in the basement of the Keller Center.
Look, my favorite Greek myth is the myth of Sisyphus. And, I just identify with pushing the boulder up the hill, knowing that the odds are it's going to roll back down at the bottom every day. But you know what? That's the work. And people say, it's impossible to change anything. But you know what? Collectively, it's the job of government to try to do the impossible. And collectively, it's the job of the citizens to say they want the impossible done and jump in and help to move us to what seems impossible.
And what's the vehicle? So if you're no longer the inspector general, but what are you, just an angry citizen that's shouting at city council? Or
I'm not angry, because people are people, and I'm a people too sometimes, and I've mentioned elevating to public consciousness this distinction of Chicago and how we can do something about it. And I'm working through the medium of a nonprofit I established this year, ReChicago. Go check it out online, rechicago.org, where we are in the process of beginning to populate all sorts of information about how Chicago operates, how Chicago doesn't operate the way it could operate, aspects of other cities. And this is something that happens everywhere around the rest of the United States. In November, New York City passed changes to its charter. The city of Portland just hit a hard reset on the structure of its government, changing the composition of its city council and the powers held by the city council versus the mayor. The reason I say this can be done is everybody else is doing it. And if everybody else is doing it, then I'm quite certain that we can do it.
I believe in us too. And that website again was rechicago.org. If you go there, you look at what is ReChicago. In 4 sentences, I think that kind of does a beautiful way of summing up what this whole conversation was about. And I won't read it because we are short on time, but it's a great website, a great resource, definitely worth checking out. Joe Ferguson, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. We have one last question that we haven't prepped you on, but that we ask all the guests. What is your favorite place to go to for non-deep dish pizza in the city?
Spacca Napoli, which is in Ravenswood, thin crust, Neapolitan pizza, brick oven, exquisite crust, exquisite sauce. I've never, and this labels me as a non-Chicagoan by definition, never been a fan of deep dish pizza, just too much of everything, right? All at once. It's a gluttonous affair. It's a good time, especially if there's beer. The elegance of pizza is found in Neapolitan pizza. Spacca Napoli on Ravenswood.
Awesome. Joe, thank you very much. This has been an honor.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to check out the remaining episodes of the mini-series as they are released. After listening, please rate us, leave a review, and tell your friends about this podcast. And follow us on Twitter. Our handle is tweetyouralderman. That's your spelled U-R.
This episode was researched, recorded, and edited by myself, Sarah Scott, and Hannah Bernick. Sound engineering was done by Harrison Lee. Graphic design was done by Olivia DePriel. And as always, thanks to UC3P. You know, if you add organization onto the end, we can officially make it UC3PO.